Hey, welcome back to another episode of Iron Culture, the podcast. I'm joined by my host. We don't make distinctions here, but brother in iron, Eric Helms.
Thank you for joining me once again. It's a privilege to be doing this Iron Culture thing with you again, and to have our first repeat guest, Dr. Dominic Morais.
Yeah. Dr. Morais than B, Dr. Dom, aka Dr. Domination. Don't ask how that nickname came to be, but this is the kernel of this podcast idea. When myself and Eric first started talking about it, the origins were historical, where we want to take a historical look at the lifting culture as a whole. That's the name Iron Culture. So now we have a historical, cultural, and then a scientific approach to lifting, but history was very much an important part of it. And Eric actually made me order two books, Mr. USA, and then is this Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors. And so
Randy Roach's Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors, and then John Fair's The Tragic History of an American Icon, the story of Mr. America.
Yeah, and so we had our first episode with Ben Pollock and Dominic Morais, taking a look at the history of lifting from the 1700s into the 1900s. This is going to be a sequel. We do recommend that you listen to that first episode. If, however, you haven't and you just want to listen to this episode, it's all good. We're going to take a look basically from the 1900s all the way into the 1960s. You're going to see a lot of parallels of what happened during that time with what's happening currently from a social media, marketing perspective, the idolization of physiques, even in terms of what we aspire to try and look like. It all can be rooted back in history. And so I think it's important to take a historical look to better understand where we are today and where we will be going in the future.
Yeah, and this is a long conversation because there's so much more information being recorded at this point in history. So we get so much more insight. And man, we talked about nationalism. We talked about masculinity. We talked about race. We talked about everything, and then the World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and how that all was expressed and affected by and was impacted the Iron Culture, or the Iron Game, I should say. So it was just a real treat to have an expert on, especially just to be able to talk turkey with him, because I love this stuff, and I know a little bit on more so the kind of the bodybuilding stuff as an amateur historian, and it was really great to just get his thoughts on my thoughts, and for him to share all this rich history and get to the point where we're coming up to where at the end of this podcast, can we even really call it history anymore if we get into the 70s and 80s where people are still alive? I was born in the 80s, or should we just be bringing on people who are still alive and just talking to them?
Yeah. No, and so I think everyone's in for a treat. It is a longer episode, but sit down, enjoy yourself. Maybe, this one, like we say, we release them every Monday. You could come back to this because there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of information. We cover a lot of territory. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the next episode, which is the history of lifting, the sequel, the 1900s to the 1960s with Dominic Morais. Enjoy. Oh, and we are back with another episode. We're back with the Dominator, if I may call you that, Dom.
Please.
You're like, that is not...
Can we call him the Dr. Dominator?
Dr. Dominator. Dr. Domination? Is that a little too...
Dr. Domination, I think...
That whatever works. The message is clear.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
He dominates.
Now,
Yeah.
Speaking of hip-hop, the song The Message, Grandmaster Flash, right?
Well done.
I'm trying to join in on the conversation we had before the podcast, where you're like hip hop
like
heads.
A true metalhead who's trying to work his way into conversation.
Jazz, actually, my friend. Jazz would be the one. Yes, yes. But what I was going to say is we are reunited, Iron Culture, the podcast, with Dominic Morais. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
You're like, you butchered it, and I don't appreciate that.
No. That's it.
That's it. Okay.
Like my mom says, more A's than B's. That's it.
That's a good way. So I have.
Yeah. No pressure there, right?
No. Don't fail the family. Eric knows a videographer that I worked with. His name is Aus. But you have a simple rhyme to make it easy for people to understand. So he says, Aus like house. It's the one. So what you said, more A's than B's. Like it's the way, like you say that, and it's easy to remember it.
Yeah.
It's an excellent heuristic. I appreciate that. And by the way, you're our first return guest.
Yeah, returning champion.
All right.
Yeah.
And still.
Exactly right.
Dom is.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
For those that are only listening right now, Dom's beard looks extra crisp. He's making us, myself and Eric are trying to improve this podcast constantly. We had the first episode of the history of lifting from the 1700s to the 1900s with Dom and Ben Pollock. That was the only episode that was audio only. We're still working on our microphones. We come back to this episode today as a sequel, a follow-up to trace after the period of Eugene Sandow for the next several decades. But we come prepared, myself and Eric, and then Dom just has to one-up us because I don't know what video cam you're doing. All I want you to know, Dom, is that you're ready. If you so chose to do flex shows, people would pay top dollar because you're HD, brother.
Well, I appreciate it. Man, that means a lot. Yeah. Hopefully my content can be HD too.
No, your enthusiasm.
We know that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you only have to take one look at Eric's Instagram to see the passion that he has for lifting culture, and then having you on the podcast, you and Ben, talking about the history of lifting is palpable. That's why I cracked that joke about Eugene Sandow, where you said, "Dude was cut up." Like this is a guy that wants to get a PhD in this stuff. It's an elective choice on your part, and so we're honored to have you again. The sequel to our first history of lifting culture from the 1700s to the 1900s. This is going to be the follow-up. So those that have not listened to that first episode, perhaps check that out. But this one is going to be a follow-up to that episode.
Yes, absolutely. And if you did not listen to that first episode first, I highly recommend you do. But just for those who haven't yet, Dom, could you introduce yourself and just give us a little background on who you are and what you're about?
Sure. My name is Dominic Morais, and I teach at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I teach sport management there. I got my PhD in 2015 from the University of Texas at Austin under Jan Todd, who is, if you know much about lifting and its history, you know that she is absolutely like on one of the thrones of, Iron Game legends. Her and her husband, Terry Todd, were there and really helped to shape who I am as a historian and in many ways as an academic. Since my time at the Stark Center, I've moved a little bit away from history and started looking at the fitness industry from a more contemporary perspective. But as you can tell from the last podcast and now, the passion will forevermore remain.
Yeah. Love it. That is awesome. Yeah, and just as someone who got the opportunity to visit the Stark Center, there is really nothing like it that I've seen in the world, and it created so much gratitude within me for, I guess, the rich history that is behind just simply lifting. Made me appreciate it, made me look at it differently, and I think large in part it's what has fueled Iron Culture podcast to get started, and me and or at least on my end, of course. I know Omar also really appreciates it, but we bring a lot of different things to the table. But that's one of the pillars of my motivation for this, so it's a big honor to have you back on.
Thanks a lot, y'all. Samesies. I can't really say that again, but samesies.
I just like hot guy babe, so I'm in Muscular Men. Eric said, you need to get these books, and I said, what's it called? Muscletown, USA? Okay, I'm in, guys. Yeah. Oh, they lift? Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Wow.
So for this one, to begin, Dom, can you actually just give a really brief summary of where we left off with Eugene Sandow? So the kind of climate, the situation, where lifting culture was in the early 1900s?
Yes, most definitely. So in the early 1900s, we're coming off of, so again, I'll go back to culture. The late 1800s, Victorian era values. Eugene Sandow he's taking off his clothes, he's putting powder on himself and emulating Greek and Roman statuary. The highest class members of society are looking at him and starting to really shape the way that we look at the body is now, okay, it can be a form of pleasure, a form of enjoyment, and not something that we just have to cover up ankles and wrists and elbows on women especially. So he's changing that. And slowly but surely, especially with this, we had that big movement called muscular Christianity that was really pushing team games. But a lot of people started piggybacking off of that as we will see, and using physical culture and the iron as a way to also push that moral, what's it called, like moral edification while also building the body at the same time. So those kind of like religious spirituality types of, sound mind, sound body concepts.
So kind of the merging between some of the Christian values with some of the kind of ancient Greek values expressed physically, which is super interesting. And that's kind of what's producing this burgeoning physical culture that would eventually become the quote unquote iron game in the 1900s through 1930s. So there was a young gentleman born in 1898 by the name of Bob Hoffman, who is, just a young babe at the time of Eugene Sandow hitting his peak in his career as both a muscle man, strong man, progenitor of bodybuilding, and an entrepreneur. And I think that's probably a good segue to start talking about what would become the Hoffman era and the strength and health era, and really what you looked at for your dissertation.
Yes. Yeah. So Bob Hoffman starts Strength and Health magazine in 1932. In between that time, I see like 1900 and 1932 as not a no man's or no person's land necessarily, but there are some things going on there that I think it's important for us to realize. And so I'll just start kind of setting the scene again. So again, we still have muscular Christianity coming through. We also had, not only Eugene Sandow, but people like Louis Cyr, right, were also very popular at the time. It was this era of traveling strongmen. You have Health and Strength in the United Kingdom, which is another magazine that had come out that Strength and Health pulls a lot from. You have Physical Culture that starts in 1899, which is a magazine by Bernard McFadden. And whereas Physical Culture was a muscle magazine, it was also kind of a pulp magazine. And what they mean by that is pulp, there's really, really, really thin pages so that they can be published very quickly, low quality, but it was this mix of almost like a bit of like sexual tension with some of these stories that were mixed in, but also Bernard McFadden was not afraid to put women in lingerie-looking clothes or even like leotards and let them show themselves, to the point where he got in some big trouble. Charges were brought against him about like being, I don't know the actual charges, but Jan wrote about it. And so either way, like that exhibition of women's bodies too started to gain attention. So we're seeing from a publication standpoint, Physical Culture doing some big things, but from a cultural standpoint, so we have A.G. Spalding, who is creating the sporting goods industry, and others are creating the sporting goods industry. I think Pope Bicycle at the time too is around. And so people are moving toward a more systematic view of sports. Industry is allowing us to do this. It's becoming more industrial. People are moving. We got to remember, it wasn't too far before that people were actually using clocks. And now in factories, right? In factories, men are losing their self-esteem because they feel like at one point in time where they could live their own lives, now they feel like their lives are being run by a clock. Like, can you fucking imagine? Like, I can't, right? Like, I tell my students that exact thing minus the F word, but I'm just like, can y'all imagine that at one point in time you feel like you're master of your fate, captain of your soul, and now you're in the factory and you are literally counting down, kind of like you see on The Office when Stanley is like, oh no, that clock is too slow, right? And then so he gets out. And so these types of things are changing, but also we have more leisure time. I think we talked about it more slowly but surely. We're getting leisure time, but now we get leisure time, not just for the upper class, not just for the middle class, but also for lower classes as well. And similar to those concepts that we talked about last time, if you don't have anything, well, you build your body, right? Maybe you don't build a house or you build your estate, but you can build your body. So all those things are going on. The last thing I really want to mention is really the first modern muscle magazine in the United States is Strength by Alan Calvert, which starts in right. I think 1914, after he created Milo Barbell Company. And if I I'm pretty sure, because I looked this up today just to be sure, but in Kim Beckwith and Jan Todd's article, they talk about his innovation was an adjustable barbell. So whereas we think of adjustable barbells as, okay, like you can go to Planet Fitness and find adjustable barbells, right? At that time, that was something new because they were just globes. And so you couldn't have just, okay, 100, 115, 120, whatever. Like you couldn't do that. But now progressive resistance training was becoming a thing because you have that adjustable barbell. Now maybe people can bring it into their homes instead of just having one big old hunk of metal all put together that doesn't even revolve maybe. So that's just a huge freaking deal that's going on at that time. Then he creates Strength Magazine, like I said, in 1914. Eventually, Strength Magazine it goes under a different owner, and they sell the rights to Bob Hoffman in 1935. But as we'll talk about, Bob Hoffman really, really borrowed a lot from both Strength Magazine and from Health and Strength Magazine in the UK. So that's kind of like really setting the tone. Oh, also Great Depression, right? Depression. Yeah. So that whole thing, right? Like more than a third of the population is unemployed. And then Bob Hoffman actually makes a lot of money as a oil burner salesman, enough money to start to buy that stuff and really start his journey, if you will, or his quest to really being a BMOC within the iron game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he does some pretty interesting. The first thing I was thinking is just how I think there's parallels to that with other technological innovations that we've had over the years. Like, it wasn't too long ago, I was just talking to Omar about sometimes feeling like chained as a businessman to the way I utilize social media, and how it can be distracting to me or something that causes me strife and I didn't expect it, much like the clock, during the Industrial Revolution. And this is also a time when communication is improving, where now the telephone is becoming more common and where you can actually travel distances a little more easily. And this whole creation of the magazines, they basically become, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the foundation for where the culture of the iron game actually settles, kind of like now it's settling on Instagram or on YouTube. This is one of the first non-geographically restrained cultures. Although, of course, there was a delay compared to now social media. But now you've got, similar to now, pressure from social media, but also the benefit of social media connecting lifters. And then back then, we had the Industrial Revolution and the technology that came along with it, connecting iron gamers, but also creating stresses in their lives. So I think that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, it's really cool that you bring that up too, because that's what my dissertation was about. I talked about this idea of brand community, and so let's say, to kind of illustrate this point, you could go so far as to say like Apple versus PC, right? Like you see someone who has an Apple computer and you probably have some sort of, maybe you make some stereotypes about this person, but at the same time you feel like, oh, I'm connected with this person. I have at least some things in common. Or take it into sports and you see someone who's wearing a Yankees cap versus a Red Sox cap, right? You're going to maybe have a little bit or a lot of bit of hate for one individual, where you have a lot more affinity for another one. And so that's really what I feel like the magazines really started to do. Whereas the last podcast we had, you asked this question, Eric, about like were there competing, like were there battles of styles and stuff. And so this is where I think we start to see that. Oh man, one other person that I forgot to mention is Charles Atlas, right? The 97-pound weakling as well, who gets his start from Bernard McFadden's Physical Culture magazine. He wins this competition, and then he starts putting out these ads of, don't get your sand kicked in your face at the beach. Boom, masculinity is strong. Right? Like phallic. It's phallic.
Yeah.
And so we see that going on too. We see other entrepreneurs like Earl Lederman starting to, and Ben would be a good person to talk to about this, because he talked about these mail order entrepreneurs, very similar to how we see on Instagram. People, like buy your this program or that program. Well, they were doing the same thing through mail order, and they were cookie cuttering that too, right? So, so not everyone was real and really doing it for the best, but a lot of people were still just trying to make money. To go back though to that idea of community, I mean, Sandow in his magazine had this readers club. Health and Strength had a league, and even Strength magazine, half of the magazine was full of testimonials from people. And so when you have those testimonials in that magazine, ultimately what this is doing is you don't have that one voice anymore, but you're hearing from the community as well. And so now you feel more embedded with that community. It's actually just being created. Granted, it's in the pages of the magazine, but when you have things like picnics that Strength and Health ultimately did later to invite people, maybe you see those people in the magazine. Maybe you see someone like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget names now, but oh my gosh, if you see, oh my gosh, this is embarrassing, but right, like if you see the 1936 Olympic weightlifting champion, right, like, oh my, and then that's the same person at the picnic, kind of like going to the Arnold.
That's what I was gonna say. The parallels to today is pretty crazy, man, where it's like seeing your favorite Instagram influencer or whatever, fitness professional, and then the same idea, you go to as you said, this picnic that they hold, and you see the person that you've been reading the magazine of.
Yeah, honestly, it reminds me on a probably a larger scale. We used to do 3DMJ mashups. So back there was a little period in Sacramento where I was there. The whole crew was all in Northern California. Matt Ogus was there, and we would get together at a gym with like 80 people and just train together. And it was people who normally were only connected online. So I think you see that at a small level, and then like the Arnold, it becomes not just an event for sport, but a social event.
Which is wow. Yeah,
and that's absolutely in a big way what they did. So I guess let me start back, because I'll go crazy if I don't. But I want to kind of put this chronologically too to help, because with this energy, who knows what's going to happen. So
we're riding that wave, bro.
Yeah, let's ride. So right, starts in 1932. And it's really interesting to note, and John Fair wrote about this as well, and John Fair is the penultimate, like he is like Bob Hoffman, like he went to York, John Fair went to York, got their stuff, put it in his car, like all the records. So I mean, he is the person on York. Again, he wrote the book Muscletown USA, etc., hot babes, hot dude babes. And so ultimately Bob Hoffman tried to get on a committee for weightlifting in the United States, but they didn't let him. And so, like, Bob Hoffman had a big old ego. He had a big ego, and you can, like, anyone who would talk to you about that would say that. But what he did instead was just try to wrangle control by creating his magazine, by creating the York Barbell Club, where he actually brought lifters in and gave them a job and said, okay, now you lift with me. And now York Barbell Club essentially becomes really the first like Olympic weightlifting training grounds for the United States. I mean, that's ultimately where a lot of individuals came from. He was sponsoring lifters illegally, but sponsoring lifters nonetheless.
Skirting what amateur means, right?
Yeah, right. Like, and what has amateur ever freaking meant?
Yeah.
But with that idea, like he has those people coming in, and he's trying to become, again, big man on campus, really making sure that he has some control of weightlifting. And so you could psychoanalyze him a little bit and wonder like what types of American values came from that. He did sports when he was young. Was there this idea of like masculinity, of essentially kind of like being the big dog among the quote big dogs of lifters? And you can see that later when he and Weider's kind of get in their pissing match, as the Weiders called it. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, though, too, is I feel like Bob Hoffman was I feel like he's more complicated too, because one of the, I don't know where this piece of evidence came from, but I think John Fair mentioned it somewhere in his book that he went to World War One, and if you know about World War One, and I don't know much about it other than it was just extremely, I mean, war is hell in the first place, but that trench warfare, just disgusting, like using mustard gas, seeing people die, like only gaining an inch or two at a time, and seeing people just die off. And you know, whatever it is, like Bob Hoffman wrote about it in some of his stuff, but it said that somewhere that he had to sleep in the same bed with his brother for a few months after coming back from the war, right? And so he probably dealt with PTSD as we know it in a lot of ways. Yeah. It's just a really interesting way to look at it. And, you know, you can't just like shit all over this dude for being, you know, for having an ego. Like, no, not even close, because he's done so much. But I think all of us are just complicated people. And that's history can allow us to perhaps reflect on our present day by looking at others, which is going to be a theme that I'll probably say multiple times again. But
yeah, and I think this is probably something we can all agree on, just being a part of, you know, the bodybuilding lifting community, is that there's a lot of good people, or at least I'll say it to be the most open to being negative, is that there's a lot of people who produce a lot of positive things that still have an ego. You know, you can be wrapped up in a little bit, but still have an overall positive net impact on our community. And I think that's probably a pretty fair way of looking at Bob Hoffman.
Yeah.
So this is interesting too, because where we left off in episode 1 was when I asked about actual lifting competitions. It was very much in its burgeoning phase, and most of the time it was these impromptu shows without any kind of, there's no referee, it was a couple of people challenging each other on stage, and now we're actually getting into a period where there's legitimized weightlifting as sport.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think weightlifting started as an event in track and field, and then actually became its own Olympic event, I believe in like the mid to late 20s. And by the time Bob Hoffman's trying to get involved, it's a serious legitimized sport, and it's got its 3 lifts. And it's something that there is something to actually vie for control of, which is in stark contrast to like the 1900s.
Yeah, so... Yeah, you're right. So I'm not sure if it comes out of the track and field, but I do know that there were 2. I think it's called the ACWLA, if I'm not mistaken. Again, John Fair wrote about this in the beginnings of weightlifting, but again, this is part of where Hoffman tried to get into. And was not allowed in. Ultimately, it turns into the AAU starting to become involved with weightlifting as well. That's like, I'm not going to be able to speak to this as well as I should be able to, but there was so much, what's the word for it? In sport management, we talk about sports being a contested activity, not that it was just like handed down from God or some spiritual being in this like treasure chest, like Zelda Ocarina of Time, and then it opens it for you, and there it is.
Greatest game of all time.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. So, with that in mind, that story is really illustrative of a lot of wheeling and dealing and a lot of political wranglings, and, you know, someone trying to do this one way, maybe just getting enough people this way. What is the idea of legitimization? And to be honest, Eric, like I should have, this is one part of it that I didn't refresh myself on. I don't know enough about this to be able to speak to it as well as I should. But again, I know that it was small. It was little things popping up here and there. We always get a lot of pull from the United Kingdom and the way that they were doing it. But again, one thing that did help to modernize the sport was Strength Magazine, because now everyone could see there were standardized lifts, there were quantifications being measured, and now everyone was literally on the same page of Strength Magazine. Yeah. And so that did help to spread that. But with the details, man, I'm sorry. That's something I should have looked up a little bit more.
Oh, no, you're all good. I think the main point I wanted to make, and which I think you illustrated absolutely fine, is that not only do we move from individual showmen challenging one another to legitimize, I think the acronym was the American Continental Weightlifting Association or something like that.
And it's
which was formed similarly to the one in but it's pretty much just the UK and the US. And actually now having weightlifting as its individual sport in the Olympics, it's a stark contrast.
Yes.
And like you said, the first weightlifting club is started by Bob Hoffman off the back of, a factory, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is just very, very interesting. And now around that, there's this whole culture based through magazines, which I just think is, it just goes to show you how much can change in a matter of 3 decades.
Yeah. And it's really, really crazy. So one of the coolest interviews that I did for this dissertation, I forgot his name, but he was a good 93 years old when I interviewed him, right? His still was of sound mind. And he talked about how, and he even put on a few weightlifting competitions in the 40s. And he talked about how literally, like, they'd read the magazines, and in the magazines, they would share how they kind of started to put together their weightlifting equipment. And so, they're just walking down the railroad trying to find a spare axle and a rod so that they can just put it together and have their own weight set. Like, that's how they got stronger. And then they would use the articles and everything from the magazine. And I think here's a great time for me to start actually talking about the content of the magazine. So it really piggybacked off of Strength magazine, off of Health and Strength magazine. And if you I'm not sure how many of us actually pick up muscle magazines these days, but I know when I did pick them up, that it was pretty much the same thing, right? So you have your first couple pages are advertisements, usually of York Barbell. The next page is going to be someone looking really good, right? Someone looking swole, cut up, whatever it's going to be. Usually it was someone of York Barbell affiliation. Later that changed a little bit as we see more of a proliferation with other individuals getting into it, but often it was very much York Barbell. And then you would have table of contents with articles talking about is veganism good? Oh wow, do we hear that stuff now? Yes. So is veganism good? Or way back when it was, how to save your energy, or that energy type of stuff, talking about not understanding calories or things like that, but they talk about energy. Or then they would say something they would share stories where Bob Hoffman literally wrote this series in the magazine about his time in the war, and then made that a short book from that and started publishing it too. So it was really a range of stuff. It's almost like a muscle, a little bit lifestyle magazine for men. But then you get like halfway through and you start seeing progress photos of people, and people saying like, I've used your program and it's done this, blah, blah, blah. And eventually they start doing, questions and answering questions, especially, and this is who I forgot earlier, I don't know how, but John Grimmick, arguably the best bodybuilder of all time. Yeah, I know, like that I felt very ashamed. So, when he starts, giving people advice, and like, you can imagine, like, they're getting it straight from the source. And so that's how the magazine was established, first of all, which was really cool. What I wrote about in my dissertation was that community aspect. So they created the Strength and Health League, which was a direct pull from Health and Strength, which was the Health and Strength League. So they made this league, which they wrote out rules of membership. You had to send in $1, and then you were part of the membership. You would actually get a certificate. So you would, in brand community, you badge with certain things. There's that term, and so that certification was part of that. You would get medals for certain things, like just all kinds of athletic attempts. If you swam this, if you ran that. But I think you could only get gold medals for doing just something ridiculous, or it had to be have to be something involved with weights. And then they had actual ranks within the community, so you could be like a lieutenant in the league, a colonel, or
Dom. Sorry, go on, Eric.
Go ahead. You go ahead, Omar.
If you will. If you will. I was gonna say that. Can you talk briefly, Dom, about the changes in terms of the aesthetic ideal? Because when I was reading about Bernard McFadden and what he was seeking when he would hold those competitions, were part, as you said, it was a little bit your moral character, as well as the type of physique you had, were I guess to use phrases, they're a little bit more lean, maybe a little less muscle bound, and then you see guys entering the stages kind of like either Atlas or now John Grimmick. Anyone that doesn't know John Grimmick, just Google him, Grimek. Like this dude, as Dom would say, is not only cut up, he is swole as hell. But can you just comment throughout those last several decades? So from the 1900s to now, we're talking late 1930s, 1940s. Just the attitudes in regards to physiques, because clearly if you compare the individuals from the early 1900s, some of them to now the Grimmicks who are also competing in weightlifting, there is kind of a subtle change. I feel I could be wrong. Correct me, Dom.
No. I don't think you're wrong at all. I think a lot of it goes back to just how weights were becoming popularized in the first place, and they were becoming popularized. Okay, so first of all, it was through those strong men. Essentially. And so let's think about some of the movements that they did. Like you weren't going to be as impressed by a strong man or strong woman if they laid on their back and pressed something. You were going to be impressed if they put something over their head.
Right.
So you can imagine how if you do more overhead types of pressing, how your body's going to look compared to maybe something like a bench press, because the bench press didn't become popularized until I think the 1950s or so. And then you start to see physiques really changing with lats and pecs becoming a much bigger deal than they were before, as we see more symmetrical and really filled out, if you will, individuals. But considering that weightlifting was the means I don't know how to express this necessarily, but like that was the relationship with the iron that was going on, if I can term it that way. And so you're going to see individuals who were probably more athletic looking versus like maybe hard to like rumbling, tumbling, more like rhinos versus, however you might compare a more athletic looking individual. But then it was interesting that, we didn't even see physique start coming in until I think like the late 1940s, when it becomes, and John Fair has a book about this, it's called Mr. America something, and it's a really, really he's just the man, so he does history right. But then we start seeing this creation of these competitions, but with this idea of moral character being part of it.
Yeah.
We can still see those amateur ideals coming through in a time in which, like, again, like this dude, very kind of contradictory. He is paying for people, but he also wants to make sure that these people are of moral character. They have good teeth. They look good. Yeah. So I feel like it's some branding stuff going on. I feel like it's laying claim to, this is the competition that we're going to do. Weider, who starts putting out his magazines in the 40s, like, nah, dude, like these are going to be ours. We're going to do it this way. And one of the reasons that they put in those morals and just like that fluffy category was so that they can ensure that Hoffman's people won. So that's also another kind of like, all right, Hoffman's good, but like he was rough,
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say quickly, sorry, Dom, when you said it's Mr. America, Eric recommended the book to me, The Tragic History of a Bodybuilding Icon. When you remarked just little things in terms of their aesthetics, the teeth, I remember reading that was one of the things that they were judged on. I understand they're going for the overall ideal, the ideal man or individual. They also had women competing, but the fact that they look at your teeth, the quality of your teeth, as one of the judgment criteria.
Yeah, it's like Westminster out there.
Yeah, it's interesting how it evolved from Bernard McFadden to the AAU Mr. America to then Weider taking the hold way down the line from where we're at of bodybuilding, and how there was this very intentful effort from all the way from the Greeks through Bernard McFadden to Hoffman era to try to maintain some element of, hey, it's not just about your body, but that's representative of something. Not always cultural ideals that make sense to us now in 2019 or things that were even accurate of what the Greeks believed. But the point is that it should be more than just your physique. And it's interesting how, and this is probably jumping ahead too far, Weider just wanted to say, hey, look, can we just appreciate people for the physiques they build? And that created just some huge strife in the community. So it's just what the body means is something that was a battleground for more than a century here in physical culture.
For sure. And honestly, one of the things that comes into my mind, and I know these are just rumors, but I think they're rumors for a reason. I mean, isn't Kai Green doesn't he not do some of the big competitions because of his history of relationships with the homosexual population? Like, yeah, and so.
Yeah, I don't think they talk about it. Like, no one said a statement, Dom. But yeah, he stopped competing at Mr. Olympia because I think, as some people speculate, that they won't give him the Mr. Olympia because of his past.
Right, and so that to me, sure, it's a rumor. I still feel like, you know, we still haven't got. We don't judge subjectively. Like, I mean, it's not a subjective judge, but you know, still those ideas of like who the person is inside of the body seems to mean something even today, when it's so easy for us to be like, oh, we're past that. Like, yeah, so don't get me started on that.
Well, I was going to say, real quick, that who won, Eric, actually Mr. Olympia this past year? Do you remember? It wasn't Phil Heath. It was
Sean Roden.
Yeah, sorry, that's his name. And what I was going to say, it's so interesting Dom mentions that. I haven't connected this. There actually was a minor, and I'm not trying to spread gossip here or anything, but just rumors about Phil Heath and his character that maybe, I'm not saying this is why he lost at all, and I'm not trying to spread gossip, but around the time and several months before that Olympia, just some controversies surrounded Phil Heath that came into question his character. And so I'm not saying that the two are related at all, him not winning another Olympia, but how the judges and those that sponsor those competitions, how that is very much in the back of their minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we can underestimate the echoes of the roots of bodybuilding that in some way, like even if you listen to, say, like Jay Cutler talking about being Mr. Olympia, like he wants to be a good representative of the Olympia. So it's not, even though Weider ended up being the top dog, it never became a pure physique sport, and quote unquote politics has always been a part of it. And like if we look at the echoes of some of the stuff that Dom's been talking about here, it's still present. Like we had, you know, the archetype of the guru and the star that went all the way back. We had, you know, Attila and Sandow. Then we had Hoffman and Grimmick, and then we had Weider and Arnold. And that hasn't changed. You know, now when people talk about politics, they see it as I've got to be the IFBB star to get through the Olympia, you know, or I have to be just the way they want me to be, because it is a subjective sport. And I think the depth of that subjectivity is probably a little deeper than we acknowledge. And I think you'll see the judges and the organization trying to use the Olympia or the Mr. America or whatever the dominant physique competition is to try to enact social change. So for an example, another interesting thing about Sean Roden is that his physique's a bit of a throwback. People were all pointing out how, you know, Phil Heath couldn't control his gut. And, you know, ever since Dorian, we've been looking at these physiques where we feel that something has been lost at the cost of mass. And that's not a new theme either. So Sean Roden is kind of this maybe attempt to pull people back towards a more aesthetic physique. But we saw that with Frank Zane back in in his three-time Olympia span. And we even saw that back in the 50s and 60s numerous times, even though the extremes were much smaller, as there was a period where there weren't steroids, or then there was a period where the steroid use was much less. So it's just so cool to me how the echoes of the stuff that happened in the 1900s are still echoing now in 2019, and it's been a very similar revolution over time.
No doubt. Like I just agree.
Dom's about to hit that. It's like, whoa. Give me a counter. No, absolutely. As soon as it's so interesting having you back on, Dom, and talking about these things, because as you're just explaining, okay, this is what's going on in the 1930s. Eric and myself, all three of us can see, it's like, yep, this is a complete parallel to today. Or even as Eric said, the echoes of that which they were judged for at that time, how it's echoed now down, and even subconsciously, if we don't talk about it, when you mentioned Kai Green, I'm like, yeah, of course that is a factor, whether or not people want to admit it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll just like bring it back to like move us on chronologically, if that's cool. But One of the things is I'm kind of thinking again about this idea of community, like Bob Hoffman, I feel like in a lot of ways was really a genius, in that, you know, when you think about communities, you often like to seed the community. So like plant a seed in a way to kind of get people talking. One person that I think present day that does this really well is Cale Beck in the starting strongman community. Like he seeds it extremely well and like puts out topics or says things or puts out a meme or a post, and it gets people going. It gets the people going. And so,
yes.
Like Bob Hoffman, in a lot of ways, I think he did similar things. For instance, Bob Hoffman sent he got letters from people in San Quentin prison. He then sends a whole thing of Strength and Health, a whole like bushel, I think, of magazines, Strength and Health magazines, and then he eventually sends them weights and makes a visit there too. Like, can you imagine what that does to you as a prisoner, feeling like someone thinks that I'm redeemable? Yeah. What? Like, that is absolutely nuts. And to think, and I mean, like those men who he probably touched and talked to and used those weights, like their great grandchildren may very well have still had York barbell stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like that to me is a really good testament of how businessman he was. But so kind of moving on. So the 1930s, he's doing that. The Strength and Health League is really happening, and so he becomes that in weightlifting becomes the preeminent, like, this is what's going on in the iron game right now. Like, this is physical culture in America. We're doing weightlifting. We're in the Olympics. We're balling out in the Olympics. Like, we're filling up the weight classes. York barbell is doing what it's supposed to be doing. These people are training. At the same time, you know, he's bringing them in. If they're good, come on in. Like, you know, similar to how, like, you just scout people out and you see someone who's good and you think that you can, you know, help them out, and you do. So that's going on at the time. He's building community with his picnics. He starts doing these competitions where he brings people into York. He fills up this park. He brings, you know, people give food, or he's giving out food to everyone who goes there, putting on these clinics. People are doing exhibitions. It's just a big, like, grand old time, right? And so eventually, though, that has to stop because of World War II. Ultimately, World War II, obviously, it changed so much. It changed the magazine. It changed the state of the it changed the state of the Union. So much was happening. Ultimately, after World War II, but we'll talk more about it. After World War II, there was a huge boom in physical culture at the time. So if you look historically at weight training or physical culture around wartime, like, there's always a huge boost, because, as this is probably no surprise, one of the reasons for sport and one of the reasons for, like, weight training in particular, physical culture, is to prepare the men to be able to defend the nation. Right? Like, as, you know, gendered and stuff as that is, like, that's one of the reasons that people cite for this stuff. And so I think even Sandow, in England, like, after World War I, they looked at how many people were rejected from the draft. And so he goes and offers to train people for that. And the same thing happens, like, every war. Like, oh, these many people were out of the draft because of, you know, like, bow legs or whatever it was. And so, boom, everyone starts talking, okay, we got to do this again. And so Hoffman, so what's happening then? So the magazine starts changing. We start to hear, he's starting to write about the Japanese and the Germans as being very, like, especially the Germans. He starts presenting them as very machine-like and robot-like, similar to the same stereotypes that maybe they're talked about during FIFA World Cups these days. But he is conveying them as looking that way, starts to worry about them as the entire nation thinks about it, what's going on there with Hitler, etc. And then, you know, once, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor happens, I mean, the entire magazine, it turns into, like, the Americas edition, and it's a big, and I mean, he's preached he's preached, it's really interesting, like his brand is very much American. So this idea of weights and American patriotism, like, man, as far back as that time, like he was big on it, big on it. Probably because of his own roots of, being in World War I. But also because many of the people that he brought in were immigrants to train, and this idea of melting pot and this Horatio Alger's pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like anything is possible type of thing, go into the next class, make something of yourself. All of that mythology or ethos, whatever you want to call it, that brand personality was part of weight training. We can even see that today, like empowerment this, empowerment that. So that was happening. Boom, 1941 again happens, the war starting, and one of the biggest things that I saw in the magazine, as well as in the United States happening, is that, again, like Rosie the Riveter, women start to play a bigger role in society. Not that they didn't play a big role before, but let's just say now they are filling in roles that were more recognized because they were filled by men. I think that's a more accurate way of putting that. And so with that, one of the biggest standouts that comes from that is Abby Pudgy Stockton, who we still see on memes and stuff today.
Oh, that's the...
Yeah, that, or her holding that circus dumbbell over her head, or that one on the beach where she has it above her head and she's in a split position. You'll talk to people and they like had, she had the pinup body. Like I'm learning more, we cannot get, if we're talking fitness, we cannot ever get away from the sexualization both of men and women, because it's the body. But with her, she was voluptuous, right? She was stereotypically attractive. She had a smile that could melt any person's heart. And apparently, from what, I've never been able to interview her, but Jan interviewed her and some other people talked to her. She was just had a heart of gold, just a really, really wonderful person. And she really gets her rise there. Her and her husband were doing gymnastics in California. They go to Muscle Beach, and then a photographer from, I think, Pic magazine, PIC apostrophe, takes a picture, and then she's just picked up by so many of these other magazines. Her pictures are being put everywhere. Again, similar to how we see some woman, like on say local news, when they do a story about a woman who's really strong, and then people who don't know about strength see it and they're like, oh my God, like people do this stuff, the uninitiated, if you will. When they start seeing that, it becomes a really big deal. So that same stuff is happening with her. Another big deal is they're at Muscle Beach in Santa Monica. There are numerous military bases in California, and when a lot of those men were being moved around, often, they do some training in California, they move somewhere else, then they go abroad or whatever it's going to be. A lot of them would go to Muscle Beach and just come in contact with people doing adagio, which are those kind of like body weight acrobatics, and also actually lifting and having lifting competitions on the beach. They put a platform there and built that. And so the war exponentially spread physical culture, because instead of it just being like that slow, bit by bit, almost like here's a little bit more of a rate diameter or whatever, a bigger circle and then a bigger circle and a bigger circle. Well, now you have people in Muscle Beach. You have military bases with weights that Hoffman often gave to them or sold to them. Now all these people are moving around, and it starts spreading like wildfire in a much more accelerated way than it had in the past. And that, to me, that's just absolutely mind-blowing that a war really helped. And you can see it in the letters. People are writing in from all sorts of military bases. They're making their own weight stations, bringing in people who have never seen weights before, bringing weights in on ships even. And then, so you can just imagine how a lot of little bitty ripples, I guess, are happening to really spread the iron game in a way that it hadn't been spread before. And that, to me, is kind of the big next step in like what was going on culturally at the time.
That's really interesting. Question for you. I feel like we've got to talk about the AAU a little bit here.
Yes.
as that has become it's recognized bodybuilding, it's recognized weightlifting, and it currently is the American Athletic Union, for those who aren't aware, was the dominant overall governing body at this time. Could you speak to that a little bit and how Bob Hoffman was involved?
Yeah, so he was involved because he had to be involved with it. He didn't. Again, this was kind of like, I mean, he wanted to be his title of the Godfather of American weightlifting. The AAU, the way that I see it, was just another obstacle in his way of vying for power within the iron game, just this physical culture as a whole. He had to, right? Like, he had to work with them because they were holding the competitions, right? They were sanctioning it. You have to have a sanctioned event for those records to actually count. And for people to start caring about that. People were placing a lot of, especially with this becoming, like, sports are becoming modernized, right? Sports are being looked at now as a crucial part of what America represents, and as such, people are putting legitimacy in those organizations like the AAU, especially when it espouses something like amateurism, this idea of doing it for the love of something, which, you know, amateurism and Americanism and like class stuff, like it is a multi-headed monster there. But again, I think that Bob Hoffman looked at it more as kind of like an obstacle or perhaps even a necessary evil, in that they had to organize that stuff, but he would make sure, because of his financial backings, that he was involved in so many ways, like being a coach of these athletes, or even say like at his own, like at the parties that he gave, like he would always do some sort of exhibition to where maybe some of the weights that were put on were not as heavy as they were, you know,
wow.
like,
claimed to be. Yeah.
So that, like, that's where I see the AAU in this, but it didn't seem to me, I could be wrong here, but it didn't seem to me like it was an organization as dominating as, say, like the NCAA is now. It's not something that really held the reins, if you will. It provided some really great structure, some good framework, but considering that most of the weightlifting was done in the Midwest to the East Coast anyway at that time, that was a lot of the time under the purview of Bob Hoffman or people that looked up to him, just because of power that he had accrued financially, as well as just as that coach and as the people that, like, hey, you want to be good, you go there. Like Alabama in college football, like, you want to be good, like, that's probably the first step, and you get a lot of power from that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's cool just to, like, we've got a really good high-level view of what's going on socio-culturally and with the war and everything. But I think it might be good just for some of the real basics, like, so weightlifting at this time was a 3-lift competition, which is kind of interesting. There was a clean and press, clean and jerk, and a snatch. And for AAU-sanctioned bodybuilding events, they were always attached to weightlifting competitions. Like the Mr. America was held in conjunction with senior nationals. It was almost this, well, we've got to use our AAU sanctioned weightlifting to give any legitimacy to bodybuilding for it to be a thing.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly, man. That's a great point. So yeah, and it's so crucial. And I'm not trying to be an a-hole here, but I think it's really important that it, not necessarily in conjunction, but immediately after the weightlifting competition was the bodybuilding competition, right? And so you had to compete in weightlifting first before you could go do your bodybuilding competition. So someone like John Grimmick, he still has to train weightlifting some. Now, granted, he wasn't as good as others. I mean, the dude was just a specimen himself. That he obviously worked hard to get there. But yeah, you start to see at that time, you really start to see a bit of a split in people's training, and maybe even more of a specialization. Whereas it was, oh, you train, sure, but now, like, what are you training more? And so now you see people like As we move into the 40s and 50s, you see people like Steve Reeves, who is just like, I mean, the dude's a beauty. Like, there's no way around it. You give Sandow a run for his money, right? But yeah. So
who's number one in your heart, Dom? I need to know, because you just said that Reeves or Sandow. You're like, he gives Sandow a run for his money.
He does. I don't know. I mean, like, he doesn't have facial hair though, so
wow.
Until he does the Hercules, and that changes the game. I mean, he's breaking chains. It's in Italy. Like, come on. So, I don't know. It's just so interesting to me that just how political, right? Like to me, that is political. Like, to have those individuals. You have to do this first. You have to do this first. I mean, I don't know, these days, could you imagine, I don't know, combining any sport? Like, someone would be really, really upset if they had to do, like, load a stone before they could go do a powerlifting meet or something like that. Like, nah, no way.
You know, I almost think there would be interest in it because of the rise of CrossFit and that kind of desire to get back to that holistic. Even though they're not necessarily aware of the history, I think that, honestly, there'd be a market for it.
Yeah, I'm down. So it'd be whatever, some sort of strength, weightlifting, powerlifting, physical component, and then your physique. I think that'd be super cool.
That actually would be. So just let me know whenever y'all are going to do it, like in New Zealand or whatever. I'll fly out. No big deal.
I'm telling you, I've always wanted to have a 5-lift comp followed by a pose down.
So super total.
Super total
plus the physique show.
That's a day. That's a day.
Yeah, whoever lives
on hand.
If you live, you win.
Oh my God, that's awesome. But yeah, so I forgot exactly what we were talking about, but I think it was just right, the having those two come together.
Yeah,
and it did bring out a lot of changes, and I think a lot of it was prompted by this idea of, okay, there's another kid on the block starting in the mid to late 40s. You know, this upstart Canadian by the name of Weider, who's starting to put out magazines and starting to poach some of Hoffman's folks. And so that becomes, it's just another wrinkle. And as I wrote in the dissertation, that if Hoffman was the protagonist, well, then Weider is definitely the foil there, because you start to really see this idea of community happen when the strength and healthites, if you will, the people, Hoffman's clan, when they start defining themselves not by who they are, but by who they are not.
Right. Yeah.
They are not. They even made I don't know when this comic came out, but if y'all, I'm not sure if you can put graphics on the podcast, but if you can, I'll send you this cartoon. But it was like Latissimus Q Pex or something like that. And it was essentially this cartoon that people from Strength and Health made to really start making fun of the style of, like, you know, the supersets and the drop sets and the really kind of like revolutionary training styles that Weider was proposing in his magazines at the time. And they started making fun of him and then doing this caricature of this individual with kind of like a little bit longer hair. This moves into the 50s, I think. A little bit longer hair, kind of like a big poofy type hair up front, as if, like, you know, maybe a little bit more of a diva individual, with really like man boobs pecs and just like manta ray lats. You know what I'm saying? And so they really started to make a caricature of that, especially, and it's really cool too, that these cartoons and comics start coming in, because they were becoming a big deal, I think, in the 30s. But Strength and Health made one too with Bosco, and Sorinex has used Bosco, especially the mustache, for a while now. And that is super interesting because they started using Bosco. Harry Pascal, who's ultimately an editor of Strength and Health, he starts making this, and people just, like, they enjoy it, right? Like, this is not, Bosco becomes the personality of the brand. This guy who's very hegemonically masculine, as in like nothing is too masculine. You know, if it's there, it will be lifted, right? Like that's the whole point, that it's there. And you know, he has these like German types of roots. He has and this is all like what you get from just reading it. He has an accent. He has that curly Q, and kind of like he always gets in foibles. If you can like, if like that word can, yes, because it's like old timey. So it's like, you know, he gets in foibles, and so I think it's really, really cool how they shared who they are through these caricatures. And that was really, really interesting, because identity is identity is identity, even if it comes down to like people were coming down on people who did Weider. Strength and health people were coming down on Weider's camp because of how they trained. Yeah. Like, tell me identity is not real and we are a tribal group of MFers, right? Like, come on. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, the echoes are so obvious today with these stereotypes you see among bodybuilders, powerlifters, CrossFitters. It hasn't stopped since.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dom, can you break it down if Bob Hoffman here was the head honcho making waves and influencing the culture as a whole, how this young upstart from Canada, it was the Weider brothers, right? There's how basically they usurped Bob, and not only that, established, did they, I don't know what the numbers and the sales of magazines and all that stuff, but is it fair to say that the Weiders brought greater awareness of lifting culture to the masses, or no? Is that questionable?
I think ultimately the answer there is yes.
Yeah.
But I don't think that happens until Arnold comes along.
Wow.
Like without Arnold, that wouldn't have happened. But it's very interesting. So they come up in the 1940s, and then World War II is over. But so again, I'm going to go back to culture, and I'll answer that question because it always comes from culture from my perspective. 1947 happens. You know, that is ultimately the end of World War II, and immediately we go into the Cold War, right? Immediately the U.S. is starting to worry about Soviet Union and what's going on there. And so weightlifting is still a huge deal. But in the background, you have the Weiders making the bodybuilding competitions, stealing a few people from, paying these people who were, had some patronage from Hoffman or were on Hoffman's cover. They go on to Weider's cover as well. They're getting paid this way. Some contract disputes, people getting pissed off, like people being divas. That starts happening. They start growing. Granted, we still have weightlifting, what's the word, I guess? So we're winning championships in weightlifting. So the legitimacy within the realm of weightlifting is still high, right? It's still high. You can't deny that they're doing something right. They're world champions on a number of levels, but you still have this background like, well, what else is going on? Or maybe some people just don't want to do those athletic lifts, and they just want to, because it is a different style of training, right? Like, whereas, you have to do 3 lifts in a clean and then a jerk, essentially, right? Like the pull, then the squat up, and then press it. Whereas maybe someone literally does just want to be like in that movement on some sort of press or row for, a minute at a time, 2 minutes at a time straight, whatever. Maybe that's going on too. I'm not exactly sure, but you can start seeing those identities change with a lot of other things going on. So that's happening. But at the same time, you also have, and this is another article I wrote that I thought was super cool. So Paul Anderson comes around, and Paul Anderson, right, like the Dixie Derrick, this pot-bellied just lunk of a human who's like 5'8", 340 from Georgia, right, who looks nothing like a John Grimmick, right, who looks nothing like these tall, more like lively, I think that's the word, svelte, if you will, individuals. Like, this dude is waddling, right? He's waddling when he walks because he's just like
large lad.
No doubt, right?
Like, just 5'8", 340.
yeah, like that's a fantastic college like nose guard, like a D2 college nose guard, right? So So either way, so he comes along, and from a cultural perspective, they get, like, Hoffman and weightlifting gets a lot of popularity there for a bit because they go on the first cultural exchange to the Soviet Union since the beginning of the Cold War. So we had these, like, cultural exchanges where, I don't know, like, we visited them, they visited us. Eventually that turned into these track meets later on that lasted into the 80s. But, you know, that relationship, like you see on Miracle, that movie, the hockey Miracle on Ice, that was still pretty deep early on. And so we go over there on that first cultural exchange that in large part was backed by Hoffman. So he takes over. He takes Paul Anderson. He takes Tommy Kono over there. He takes, who was another individual? Oh my God, I'm like blanking.
John Davis?
No, I don't think
might be a little after his time.
Yeah, I don't think he took John Davis. But a few other people, I'd have to look it up. So those individuals go over there, and no one knows who Paul Anderson is. Out of nowhere, like, he goes against Medvedev, who was the Soviet heavyweight, and I mean, he just opens up his press, which is looked at as the rawest test of strength, right? Like, there's no snap to it. It's like, are you gonna put it over your head, homie, or what? So he opens like 20 pounds heavier than Medvedev, looks nothing like that dude either, and then finishes with 402, which was, I think, 20 pounds or 15 pounds over the world record at the time. Like, he puts 402 over his head with 15,000 people,
Insane.
Soviet individuals, and they all clap. So there's that idea of, you know, the U.S. is all about it because the American way has won over the Soviet communistic way of doing things. But it also came from this just dude who doesn't look the part, who just, you know, so he comes over, he has a day that is actually, like, named after him by the governor of Georgia, right? And he becomes a really big star of John Hoffman's for a while, with so many of those other individuals who are on those teams. Man, like, I don't know, Stanzik, others, like, there's so many to name, but ultimately, like, weightlifting is still a big deal. To, you know, so much of that is to say weightlifting is still a big deal. And Weider really doesn't start, I don't think, making waves until, say, the 1960s, when we really start to see a power shift happening. I don't know the records for the actual sales. The Weiders, they haven't given, like, they've never let anyone look at their stuff, any of their material, so we don't know those numbers. And all the numbers, all the stuff that John Fair got everything that he could from York and Strength and Health, and even the numbers weren't in there. So we can't necessarily testify to that as much as we can to say, like, what was going on within those magazines. And that's what I did a lot with my research there. Oh, the last thing, I know I'm super rambling here, but one thing that was really, really interesting that happens during the Cold War era is, and this was I think really, really interesting, whereas culturally in the past we had people who were really, really just about weights for the sake of lifting. Right now we had this idea of fitness in, like, weights for the sake of being fit, so that we could overcome and overtake the Soviets. Now it was almost like fitness was becoming an American way of life, and whereas at one point in time people felt very, very distinct from others, like, this is weights, this is what we do, right? We're going to stick to that, and we feel that identity for that. Now we have these other people coming in, and of course, being capitalistic in nature and businessman, Hoffman and his people aren't going to say, no, we're not going to cater to you. But in the magazine, you can start seeing this difference between people who just love weights for weights and people who are like, okay, I want to do this so that I can look better, so I can do this. So it became a means to an end versus the end in and of itself. And so that really starts to break the community apart some, which I think early on, so that's starting in the 1950s, even Kennedy talked about, like, so, I mean, we have the presidents, Council on Physical Fitness, which is 56 with Eisenhower. And then I think even Kennedy mentioned something about, fitness and the fitness of the nation. And so now people are looking at weights as that too. And so that really just changes the brand itself as they try to make the most money on that. And so I think that ultimately starts breaking apart the Hoffman empire and slowly but surely helps Weider, especially when later Arnold comes on board, and TV comes on board,
It's done. Yeah, TV.
Yeah.
Makes complete sense.
That's a long-ass answer for your question, but you know me.
It's a good answer, though. And I think it's probably a little too broad sweeping or not nuanced enough just to simply kind of blame the split in the lifting, or the splits in the lifting culture on Weider and kind of paint him as the snake in the grass. One of the things that I was noticing as I was reading Randy Roach's Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors was that there was a point, I believe it was the 60s or 50s. I could have my decades off, but I think that regardless of the year, the point is that Weider approached Hoffman to get an AAU sanction for his first bodybuilding competitions. And of course, based on what we know about Hoffman and his ego, he was like, I'm not giving this young upstart from Canada a sanction. And then so in many ways, it would be interesting to see what would have happened if you had this voice who's a little more pro bodybuilding, not pro bodybuilding as an after show, literally, to weightlifting. If he'd had an AAU sanction, it might have changed it a little bit. But instead, now what you have is the creation of the IFBB, the International Federation of Bodybuilders, and these unsanctioned shows that he built up so much to the point where it didn't matter that it was unsanctioned, and he created basically his own empire that, like you said, I think the final nail in the coffin to where we knew that the AAU Hoffman-dominated era was over was the rise of Arnold. So there was a lot of cracks, like you said, from the Cold War to Weider coming around, and to the kind of the closed door attitude that Hoffman took to him coming around. So I think that's really interesting.
Well, I mean, and think about it, even today, what if you don't like a powerlifting federation? You just start another one. Right? That's what happens, right? If you don't like where they're calling your squats, start another federation. And that's not knocking it necessarily. That's just the state of how things are. And to me, that's super interesting, as Weider just said, all right, cool, I'm just going to do me, right? I mean, that to me becomes the start of that trend that we see that, Jan and Terry wrote about this really, another article about that too, about the proliferation of powerlifting meets, especially the ADFPA organization federation. So, we see that there are 2 strongman federations here in the United States right now. I don't know as much about bodybuilding, but
just 2. You guys are doing great in natural bodybuilding alone. Drug tested shows that advertise themselves as being drug free. There's 30.
Wow.
Yeah. Same thing with powerlifting, and then the names change. The federation you just cited eventually became the USAPL. So only having 2, strongman's doing great. Just wait a decade though.
Yeah, give it time.
More people enter, it'll just start fracturing.
Yeah, we'll just wait for Halfdoor to create his own. So I thought that was pretty cool. I also thought that it was really interesting. So you said Weider, right, was put off by Hoffman. I mean, there was something else I was going to say there that I thought was really, really interesting, but I guess it wasn't interesting enough for me to remember. So, my bad.
But no. You said so many interesting things, and I kind of painted that cultural backdrop, and I'm just filling in some of the more kind of lifting specific stuff. Another really interesting thing that people might that I don't know if this is true, but it seems logical to me, is that basically you kind of had weightlifting and bodybuilding as the 2 things that came, and that was a bit of the war ground over Weider and Hoffman to some degree, building the body for building the body's sake versus the body being a representation of strength. That was kind of that's a loose categorization, you could say, if you're in the Weider camp or the Hoffman camp.
Sure.
But the odd lifts came out of that. You're using the odd lifts which is, the bench, the squat, and the deadlift, which aren't the competition weightlifting lifts, to build as supplementary exercises to the weightlifting lifts, or just to build your body. And then out of the odd lifts, I believe sometime in the late 50s or early 60s comes the actual sport of powerlifting. So that wasn't even a sport for a large part of the history we've been talking about, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. And so the first powerlifting competition is 1965, of which Terry Todd becomes the first, by a hair, the first national champion there. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think they were even doing odd lift competitions in the late 30s where they would include something like a curl or literally just odd lifts. Okay, we're going to throw it together. What do you got? And so that to me is also super duper interesting. And then you start to see, right, how that amalgamation and or split or a whole combination of all that so people maybe started doing bench press for the physique competitions, but now people actually just like the bench press, and so they want to get really strong in that, right? And so that even is, it's just wild. And and it makes for really cool exhibitions too. I can remember there's some picture of Paul Anderson at some picnic laying flat, and I can remember it because I can see his stomach going. And doing a bench press on just all wooden stuff that looks like if it just angled one way it would be done. But yeah, it's just so interesting. And I guess honestly, one of the things from a personal standpoint that I don't get is who the hell can say this is how you're supposed to train, this is how you're not supposed to train. That gets me today. And even thinking about it back then, who the hell are you to say that's not the way that I need to be training, or I don't want to look this way or that way? It just it really makes me, it kind of makes me think about the human condition some. And I don't want to go out there too much, but
go out there, Dom.
Even Bob Hoffman saying no, you can't do this or you can't do that. What if he was to accept him, and then maybe it becomes I don't know, maybe the government takes it over because it's still one big, and maybe they see that as easier to do. I don't know. I have no idea, but I don't know. I also can't see the government doing that either. So I don't know. My mind just went somewhere.
Dom, I was going to ask a question in regards to diversity in lifting or exposure of, you said someone in the past how he was Germanic in terms of the way he looked. Can you comment a little bit over from the 1900s now to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, other marginalized groups, so African Americans, also women in lifting, where it seems that even though expressed as a percentage of population, African Americans, there weren't as many notable lifters being put out on the magazines. I think in John Fair's book, he talks about this, how obviously there weren't the same opportunities, but in regards to what it means to even be an American, can you just talk about that a little bit in terms of those other groups that maybe did not have representation? So women that were interested in strength sports, people of color,
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So, right, you mentioned John Davis. He is, unfortunately, I feel like people kind of what do they do? Consider him maybe the token black guy within the Iron Game legends, but you also had John Terry, who was a smaller lifter. I don't know. He was a small dude, super cut up, but he was another one who would be on the pages of some of the magazines in the pages. One thing that was super interesting is that Hoffman put a picture of John Davis on his magazine, the backside of him nude, so you saw his butt cheeks, and he got some flack for that. You know, people, you can imagine people writing in and dropping the N-word here and there. And so that was for him, you got to give him credit that he did that. Right now, it's not like he had an affirmative action plan, so to speak, and trying to bring in lifters or anything. Not to say that that was his right to do so. Whatever. I'm not whatever. So that's super interesting. But I mean, you have Tommy Kono as an Asian American lifter, but often a lot of the lifters seem to be of European descent and then like lower classes from there. So you had, some Italian folks or maybe like Eastern European or even Western Europeans. But it really, I mean, because of the context, I guess think about it from this standpoint. If we look at some of the research of the quote black body these days and what it connotes to individuals, especially when you say compare someone like Serena Williams and all the flack that she takes for just about everything that she does, especially just being a black body moving around. I mean, she is a woman, but her black body that she moves in space and the connotations that we have from that. Can you imagine in that day and age, pre-civil rights and even before civil rights, or even, during or after civil rights, putting a black body on a magazine and like people's heads would have exploded. Not to say that it was right that they didn't, but it was just, I think that's an explanation as to why, like, to me, I see a big time lack in that, especially when it comes to people of color. When we talk about women, I think that Pudgy Stockton's impact was exponential and had a lot of ripples. She even created a weightlifting competition for women. I think the first one that she put on was in 47. Later, women were they were picking it up right now. Even they were picking it up in the magazine. Pudgy Stockton had a column in the magazine, and I see the magazine as very much a direct reflection of what was going on in the Iron Game at the time, because it was the biggest, loudest organ for that community. But Pudgy Stockton had her column in there, I think, until the early 50s, and she was.
That was Barbells, right? I love that title.
Yeah. And so, barbells. And so she would talk to women about, doing things healthily, picking up weights here and there, fitting it into your life, how that would help you do your domestic duties if you were that, or, just, kind of like she was very much a feminist for her time. And then after she stops, I think a year or so after she had her child, then Doris Barlow comes in, and she has a column in there that is in response to the shifting change in the quote fitness culture versus strength. Now it's like more fitness. We see her talking like. There's no pictures of her using heavy weights anymore, like the Pudgy Stockton with a big ass dumbbell. Like, nah, that's not happening.
Yeah.
Like it goes straight to like lifting like these little bitty weights with like the wrist cocked back and stuff. And so very, very much like it weakens, if you will. Like it definitely weakens from that standpoint. Not to say that women weren't still finding ways to get in it, but from a personal standpoint, I see it as a regression. But that's just I would love to see everyone be like strong as hell. So
yeah,
but that's just me.
I think, and this is just my perception, that it obviously, like with not having a Mr. America winner who was African American for decades upon decades when they probably should have been, and looking at the representation on the magazine covers being a lot less than who was lifting, like Omar said. It wasn't what it could have been, or maybe ideally with our 2019 goggles on should have been.
Sure.
But I do think that because it was such a niche sport and it was dominated by people from the lower class, and immigrants were a huge part of it as well, as much as it had that nationalistic tilt to it, I think on balance, given the time period, and maybe I'm just nice, I feel like Hoffman was relatively progressive.
I think you're spot on.
Okay, good. I guess I didn't think I was alone in that perception, but I was pleasantly intrigued to see that, like you said, he put John Davis on the cover. There's the column by Abby, but there's definitely some relegation and certainly like, no, you don't get to be here as well. And I think that was really clear when I was reading about the Mr. America competition, where I literally could not count the number of times they would say that the most muscular award was given to X, Y, or Z black bodybuilder, but who just missed top honors by a few points.
Yeah, for some reason, yeah. Has the best body, most muscular or what have you, but did not win.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think the people involved themselves saw themselves as racist, but I think they saw Mr. America is a title that's supposed to embody this cultural ideal, and I don't think they could see a black man in those shoes. And if they were, it took decades, but they would have to emulate the existing cultural norm rather than be allowed to be something a little bit different or starkly different. And the body wasn't enough. But they could win things like Mr. New York or Mr. Eastern USA or the most muscular award at the Mr. America competition. And that was something that Weider used. Weider was also very good at, I'd say he was progressive for his time, and you saw people winning competitions of all backgrounds and walks of life because it was just about the physique.
Yeah.
So I think Weider was actually able to use probably that overly traditional element of at least the Mr. America competition, if not, Bob Hoffman directly, to keep wedging his finger in that crack.
Yeah.
So it was just very interesting, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And if I can, since I believe that if we leave history in the past, there's no use in even looking at it. But I think what you said about them thinking that they, probably didn't think that they were racist. I just think, and I hope this doesn't turn off any of the listeners to your podcast, but I'm going to be who I am, unapologetically. But I think that
more A's than B.
Yeah, I think that in this day and age, there are a lot of folks, and, even myself included in a lot of ways, we don't think that we're one way. We don't think that we're another way. I started reading this book, or I read this book called So You Want to Talk About Race recently, and it really just kind of opened my eyes, because I thought I was pretty progressive in a lot of ways, but it really just helped to solidify some interesting ways of looking at it. And it seems that so many individuals perhaps do think that, that it's worth taking a second thought, just about that type of stuff, and what those things do mean. Why does everyone look the same? This, that, or the other. So I don't know. For me, I have to use history as a teaching moment, because if we don't, well, then there's really no reason why we're looking at it. So sorry to go on my soapbox there.
That wasn't even close to a soapbox, bro.
Yeah, based on your preamble, I was expecting something a little more controversial. But basically, you said, "Hey, we don't always know that just because our intentions are one way, that we don't understand the perspectives of others and might unintentionally cause problems because of that." I think that's just true. We agree. So I think now to kind of bring it all back to center, I think we've moved into the mid 60s. Would you say that's accurate, or have we skipped over anything that you want to cover, Don?
Well, we just have to know that the Olympic lifters were still badasses. Hoffman still had champions into the 50s. Powerlifting starts pulling potential athletes from physique as well as Olympic lifting. Training is beginning to change. The civil rights movement is causing a rift in the Hoffman camp, because, as you can probably tell, he was a little bit of an older school individual. As progressive as he was, times they were a-changing. And drug culture and this idea of hippies that was also something influencing some of the younger lifters, and they maybe didn't, quote, work as hard, or I don't know I think they described it as maybe them not working as hard. I imagine that maybe it was not working the way that they wanted them to, or that they were used to. But also that drug culture started having a bit of an influence as well on things. And with that in mind, you can also see some of this hard line, do it the American old school way, how that may have also contributed to the, quote, dying out of strength and health, as Weider, I think, appealed more to younger generations, and younger generations don't die as quickly. So,
they don't care about health. They just want to look good.
Yeah, and I mean they're just going to be there for longer, whereas these older ones are. It just did that. Those messages didn't resonate, I think, as much with these younger individuals coming up in physical culture. It just, yeah, it wasn't the same.
Random question, Dom, just related to, I guess, the climate of the particular area. So Hoffman was located where? Was he not on the East Coast?
Yes, he was in York,
Yeah.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And then Weider, well, they're from Canada. They moved. Did they move in the 60s to the West Coast?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was just going to ask that question about how climate maybe could influence the importance of the physique. Where in California, I've only visited maybe like 5-6 times, but because it's warm all year, people are more likely, just in general, shirts off near the beach, what have you. New York, it's a colder climate. You're bundled up most of the time. Do you think climate had anything to do with where the Weiders were going, or just the idea, that young idea of wanting to look good because your body's on display more often?
Yeah, Omar, that's a fantastic question too. I think place had something huge to do with that, of which climate is also a part of place. And so when I think about it, I've thought a little bit about it, but new things are coming to me when you ask that question. So, I mean, when you think of York, especially Pennsylvania, my first thought is like Pittsburgh and
Steel
industrial
town.
and steel town, blue collar, and maybe like some values that go along with that. Whereas California, and this is very, very, so a friend of mine, Tolga Ozerchu from Texas, so he wrote in his dissertation about how Weider used California as like this dream or mythic type of place, and I think that climate really has so much to do with that too. I mean, California was this like go west, go west. And so California is the penultimate going west, to the point where you see the Pacific Ocean and there's this huge expanse of, maybe people interpret that as opportunity or whatever, especially with Hollywood there, and looks are so much of this, and celebrity and blah, blah, blah. And man, I think that's a fantastic point to be made, Omar. Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
And you hear this echoed in when you watch Pumping Iron and you listen to Franco Columbo and Arnold talk about, in my town in Italy, they say like, it's a place you can't even go, like go to hell, like go to California. And here I am, I'm actually in California, so Weider is attracting these. Weider did an amazing job, because Hoffman was so focused on the American athlete and building that Olympic team, and bodybuilding is kind of this afterthought, that Weider started going international early. And he was one of the first few people. In the naming, the IFBB was intentional, and he was recruiting Dominican lifters, Cuban lifters. He was recruiting a ton of folks from the Caribbean area and from overseas, Serge Nubret, and making connections with all these bodybuilders and who are internationally known. And that I think is I think very much when you look at Weider, he saw all of the chinks in the armor of Hoffman and exploited them all. And that's how he eventually became that dominant force, like using the mythology of California, Hollywood, Muscle Beach, all that stuff. I think was very intentional.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and I don't think that Hoffman replenished his like staff well. I mean, it was just guys who had been in it. There was no, I mean, maybe
new
this
blood.
is a study.
Is that?
Yeah. It's a study in diversity. Like, there's no new ideas. There's no new, fresh stuff coming in. And some of the people were stealing money from Hoffman too. So like that never helps. But that, like, it's a real, to write that story would be just wild, like the both sides of it, and see like what actually happened as time went on. But yeah, the biggest thing though, from that cultural standpoint, I think what we've that really that idea of place and that idea of like international stuff, it's how the world was going.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we're starting to close in on an era now where we talked about this off camera, where you, I, and Ben and Omar were saying, hey, we can only take this so far before we start to get to the point where, hell, people are still alive from this era, and we don't have enough distance to have historical perspective on it. And I think we could probably agree, or at least you as an expert would would probably think that around the 60s or 70s is about as far as we can go and look back and feel confident that we have a decent perspective on what it might mean today. Would you say that's more or less true?
Yeah, for me especially, it's, people are still alive from this who were in the 70s, and so to me that almost means that history could change. It means it's still alive in some ways, and I don't know, when that starts to happen, I feel like, okay, maybe this is more just talking to people than it actually is like historical research. Not to say that one is more important than the other, but now to me it's more like, okay, let's hear some stories versus let's use the historical method and compare these documents and this and that and the other. So I don't know. This is honestly something that I'm also working through just as an academic, and how I see that process from an epistemological standpoint too. But yeah, I would agree with what you're saying. Again, I could have just said yes, but
nope.
You worked in epistemological, so you won that academic Scrabble game, my friend. This time, my qualitative researching friend. This time. So yeah, I think the last thing that I think we probably want to hit on is that the 60s were also the entrance of anabolics into the lifting culture. For anyone who really wants a deep dive, Omar and I talk about this because I did a whole lot of research on this in the last 5 years. Of course, amateur research, not actual academic. I don't have the PhD in anything except sports science, but just as a natural bodybuilder and being very interested in myself, I did a deep dive on this with Omar and his YouTube channel, where we talk about when did drugs actually enter the lifting scene. And while they, at a very limited sense, entered in the 50s, they weren't a part of the culture until the 60s. So can you speak to that a little bit, and how that started changing things or influencing things, and what impact you thought that have?
I think it changes everything. It changes the way that you even view, from a philosophical standpoint, it changes the way that we even view the human body. I mean, we're talking these days about gene doping potentially. What does it even mean to be human anymore? And I think that, right? Yeah, like ridiculous shit. But even back then in the 60s, when you can take these pills, right? When Ziegler's just like handing pills to people and saying, yeah, this is going to help your recovery. Well, it's going to do a lot, recovery included. And I don't know, I just think it really starts to change to where, like, I think it allows for something like this to happen. I think it allows for, do you remember that scene in Pumping Iron when Arnold is literally analogizing himself, let's just say comparing himself to a sculptor, and saying like, oh yeah, I need to put some more muscle here, so I'm going to do more lateral raises, or whatever he's going to say.
He's analogous.
It's harder because you just put clay, but I have to do the lateral raise.
Yeah. I love the accents, Dom. I think you nailed it. So he's it's analogous to being a sculptor.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, because I was not saying that word correctly. I don't think that could have happened before. I think it turns into more, I don't know, does it make lifting more transactional in some ways? Does it make that you be able to quantify it a little bit more because it's like you can reach it more easily? I don't know. But I do know that it started to, we don't have the what is it called? And I think I shared this last time. I wish we had these, like the programs that people were writing, right? We don't have the logs or anything like that. But it did make things more scientific. You have to have maybe a doctor on board. You have to have people, wasn't just a in the basement type of thing, especially when you got to those levels. So, someone who is,
I don't know, at least they think they know a lot about that stuff. Now, granted, we could all argue that, okay, well, the person who's actually been on for 20 years probably knows a lot more than a doctor would about that, which I would agree with. But I think it ushers in perhaps a new era of training as a whole that didn't affect just physical culture, but it affected sports outside of physical culture as well. And maybe hypothesize, here's the hypothesis: did that spur like other sports to become more systematic too? I don't know, but I would love if someone could tell me that answer. I don't know though.
Yeah, there's a few, like that's another area that you talk about John Fair just being a true historian. He's done a lot of work in this area as well, looking at the influence of drugs in sports and how the bodybuilding and weightlifting community were probably the kind of at the forefront for a long time, which is interesting, where it's an unorganized, self-decided participation, and then into the 60s, gray zone legal experimentation with prescribed or just gotten, pills, and seeing how it affects the body. I think it's really interesting. And another thing that happens with each one of these cultural shifts, there's also then a countercultural shift. And the countercultural shift of the drug culture in bodybuilding was then the natural movement, and like you could trace that back. Probably who I would call the godfather of natural bodybuilding would be Chet Yorton, who is someone who found out about anabolics in the late 60s and had this visceral reaction, the way he describes it, that it is the antithesis of everything that he cares about. So you can see that some of the values that were present 60 years before that in the physical cultural era, where bodybuilding is also about health, and it's the display of your health and your strength, which is also present in Hoffman. It seems like the idea of taking these experimental drugs that have side effects and can have health consequences if taken in large dosages, the whole even idea of trying to achieve something that's supposed to be a display of health by taking a drug, it just blew his mind and created, and he wasn't alone. And even today now we have, although it's a very, like I was joking about earlier, having 40 different organizations, which unfortunately isn't a joke in natural bodybuilding, it's actually just as big as normal bodybuilding. So it's this huge split again that we see, more fractured, but nonetheless, it's very intriguing to me how people don't agree on what lifting or moving should be for, why we do it, and what it means. And maybe we don't have to, and I think that's fine. And it's more about respect and coming together, which is what we're trying to do in Iron Culture. But each rift creates a counter rift, and then everything in between.
Yeah. And one thing I forgot to mention is, sorry, not to like totally disregard your point because I think it's sound, but we also have to keep in mind that the Soviets were really, really pushing drugs too, and so it was almost like in some ways we have to think about, like, sure, it was coming from bottom up too, but that top down, like nationalism and sportive nationalism and being the best also played a big role too.
Oh, you're 100% right, and that is where the first systematic use occurred. And I think, again, just to keep illustrating how awesome John Fair is, he did an analysis, statistical analysis, looking at weightlifting records, and he ascertained that somewhere between, I think, 52 and 56, the Russians all of a sudden started making suspicious levels of gains in weightlifting,
something in the vodka,
unattributable to other factors, right around the same time that the long-acting esters became available and testable and usable. So coincidence? I think not. So yeah, you're not wrong at all there.
Yeah, man. Cool stuff.
Well, Dom, I can't tell you how much we've appreciated this conversation, appreciated your time, appreciated your expertise. The enthusiasm that you bring to the table, the passion for the history that we all share.
Yes.
If you could just tell us where can people find out more about you if they're interested in your research and how to get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, honestly, people can just email me if they want. I don't know how dangerous that might
Very
be
dangerous.
right now. We'll see what happens.
Go on, Tom.
Yeah, so my email, just my Trinity email, it's D as in Dominic, DMORAIS at trinity.edu. I have a Instagram account called Brainy Brawn. And those are like two easy ways. I mean, you could, this is going to sound awful, but there aren't many Dominic Moraises out there. And so a Google search often brings up a few things that you can find stuff. But yeah, like I'm just willing to talk about this stuff with anyone. So it's fun.
Love it. So we'll definitely put your Instagram in the show notes. We'll decide whether or not it's safe to put your email, and we'll have an offline discussion as to whether we really want to do that to you, for you. And yeah, thanks for coming on, man. First repeat guest.
I love it. Again, thanks for the opportunity. I know I said it to y'all last time, but it's just so cool to be able to, like, again, life stuff in my life, like the manifestation of a lot of effort and hard work that I put in, and now being able to share it and maybe in some way, shape, or form affect someone else's life is, if there's more to life than that, like, man, I'm pretty excited about it. So thank y'all.
You are the man. You are the dominator. We will link your Instagram, as you said, in the description for YouTube, as well as on iTunes. We want to thank Dom for being back on Iron Culture. This is a sequel, a follow-up to our previous History of Lifting episode. That's episode 2, in case you want to get caught up on that. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this episode. We're back every single Monday, Iron Culture, taking a look at the historical, cultural, and also a scientific approach to lifting. You can help us out by leaving a rating and a review on the iTunes. It does help us out. I'm not saying a positive review. You give the review that you think is fair, John fair, but we will see all of you guys on that Monday episode. We're on YouTube too, and we respond. If you see the video upload, you can leave a comment in the comment section, and we do respond on occasion. So we'll catch everyone in that next episode.